about to lose my mind. One step away from the bread line.
Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Unspoken Truths Trauma in the Black Community. I'm Dr. Laretha J., and today's episode will focus on trauma and its long-term implications if not properly addressed. But before I jump into today's topic, let's recap episode 1 titled Adverse Childhood Experiences, also referred to as ACEs. In episode 1, I shared that ACEs are traumatic experiences that occur during the first 18 years of life, that physical abuse, emotional neglect, and substance abuse are the most common ACEs, that ACEs are related to negative physical and mental health issues in adulthood, that ACEs are more prevalent in the Black community as compared to any other ethnic group. This is in part due to systemic oppression and historical trauma, which create conditions that intensify the risk for adversity in Black people. That without intervention, people with 6 or more ACEs can die 20 years earlier than someone that has no ACEs, and that ACEs can be prevented. Now that I've recapped episode 1, let's shift our focus to episode 2. In episode 2, I will shed light on what trauma is. I will identify the 3 types of traumas. I will explain the consequences of trauma. I'll briefly describe how trauma affects the Black community. And I will discuss what healing from trauma looks like. What is trauma? Let's define it. As defined by the American Psychological Association, trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event. It can be in the form of physical violence, an assault, battery, domestic violence, or sexual assault, accidents, whether it be an automobile, a plane crash, or natural disaster such as a wildfire, a hurricane, an earthquake, a flood, or a tornado. It can be in the form of a medical emergency that may have resulted in a near death experience. It could be a serious illness, or a surgery can also be considered a traumatic event. Extreme stress, such as witnessing a terrorist attack or fighting in a war where you witness someone being killed, this can create or cause PTSD. Or being in a situation where you were the victim of a violent crime. According to the American Psychological Association, each of these examples can result in denial, which is failure to accept what has occurred, and shock, which is a sudden or upsetting, surprising experience. When we think about longer term reactions, we must not ignore unpredictable emotions like anxiety and depression, which are caused by genetics, a neurochemical imbalance, or hormonal change, flashbacks that stem from a specific event, or unhealthy relationships involving control, manipulation, disrespect, poor communication, etc. Or physical symptoms such as chronic pain, migraine headaches, back pain, arthritis, or chronic fatigue due to lack of sleep or an unhealthy diet, or it could also be caused by mental health conditions, or exhaustion, which can create brain fog, poor concentration, and forgetfulness. So, there are 3 types of traumas. Let us go ahead and dive into each one. The first one is acute trauma, and this results from a single incident. An example of this is someone who may be suffering from a sudden traumatic loss, such as the unexpected death of a loved one. I personally had a front row seat to this when I lost my mom the day before Thanksgiving in 2018. The second one is chronic trauma, and this is repeated and prolonged. This includes physical abuse, where someone is being repeatedly beaten, sexually assaulted, or neglected. Emotional abuse, which involves receiving constant criticism, humiliation, or isolation. Witnessing trauma, whether that be violence or death, or a natural disaster, or being involved in a war. Developmental trauma, which includes childhood abuse or neglect, witnessing parental violence, and early loss of a parent or caregiver. We discussed ACEs in episode 1. So if you missed that, I suggest you go back and take a listen to it. Institutional trauma, such as incarceration, bullying, or domestic violence. Other examples include chronic illnesses such as cancer, diabetes, or disabilities such as autism, a hearing impairment, or mental illness, or going through a financial hardship, living in poverty, or experiencing homelessness. The last of the three is complex trauma. Unlike acute trauma, which involves a single incident, complex trauma is exposure to varied and multiple traumatic events. Complex trauma is often an invasive and interpersonal nature. Complex trauma examples include child abuse, which are physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect. Again, we touched on all of these in episode 1. Interpersonal violence, such as domestic violence, stalking, witnessing violence, and sexual assault. Institutional trauma, which includes incarceration, war and captivity, refugee experiences, and medical neglect errors, such as surgical diagnosis or medication, as well as disasters and catastrophes such as natural disasters, hurricanes, floods, wildfires, etc. Terrorist attacks. We just celebrated 24 years since the 9/11 attack in New York City that occurred in 2001. Mass shootings. We had one on July 28th where a lone gunman shot 6 people in Midtown Manhattan. 5 of those people died. On August 27, a lone gunman shot 24 people at a Minneapolis Catholic church. 3 of those people died. In terms of accidents, as of May 2025, there were 60 deadly aviation crashes in the U.S. There were more, but there were 60 that were deadly. Other examples include human trafficking. And so it's important to know the signs of someone who is being held against their will. Chronic illness, and again, witnessing a loved one's death. All of these examples tie back to adverse childhood experiences, especially if the event occurred during the first 18 years of life. If you missed episode 1, again, I strongly encourage you to go back and watch it. In a nutshell, trauma is the emotional, psychological, and oftentimes physical response to a deeply distressing or harmful experience. It can stem from events such as abuse, neglect, violence, discrimination, loss, and it has the propensity to leave a lasting impact on how a person feels, thinks, and relates to others. Trauma affects the mind, the body, and spirit long after the event occurred. However, understanding and acknowledging trauma is the first step towards healing. So, what does trauma look like? A traumatized person does not have one single look per se, but their experiences may manifest through various behavioral, emotional, and physical signs. These signs can include emotional changes like anxiety, anger, sadness, and guilt. Cognitive difficulties such as trouble concentrating, memory problems, and intense memories or flashbacks. Avoidance behaviors like withdrawing from loved ones or activities that they typically would enjoy. Physical responses including hypervigilance, being easily startled, sleep disturbances, and unexplained aches and pains. Each of these actions come with a consequence. So let's now turn our attention to the consequences of trauma. When we think about the consequences of trauma, there are 3 categories: behavioral, emotional, and physical. From a behavioral standpoint, someone dealing with trauma may have uncontrollable outbursts, They may be suffering from addiction or gambling issues. Someone with emotional trauma may be dealing with low self-esteem, anxiety, and or depression. And someone experiencing physical trauma may be dealing with pain attacks or numbing. So let's briefly touch on trauma in the Black community. I am going to spend episode 3 doing a deep dive into historical and intergenerational trauma. So I won't spend too much time here. But when we think about trauma in the Black community, we must understand that trauma often runs deeper than individual experiences. Trauma is embedded in generations because of slavery, racism, systemic inequality, and ongoing discrimination. Again, episode 3 is dedicated to historical and intergenerational trauma. So if you want to go deeper, make sure you tune in. Now let's talk about healing from trauma. Now that we've talked about the trauma and what it is and how it can show up in our personal lives and in our community, I want to remind you of something very important. Healing from trauma is possible. Trauma doesn't have to define who we are. While the wounds may be real, there are ways to move past trauma and toxic stress. So how do we accomplish this? Healing can happen in many ways. The following are just a few examples of coping mechanisms to aid in that journey. Therapy, counseling, and mental health support. So while therapy has been considered to be taboo in the Black community, it's vital. Trauma-informed therapy such as eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is used to treat PTSD, or cognitive behavioral therapy, which is designed to help individuals identify and change unhealthy thought patterns and behaviors. These methods can help individuals process the trauma and develop coping skills. Faith, prayer, and spiritual reflection. Having safe conversations with trusted friends, family, and mentors. The best way to do this is to build reliable, supportive relationships that consist of family, friends, or professionals who can offer empathy as well as encouragement. And then spending time journaling, meditating, and self-reflecting, self-care, all of which nurture our minds, our bodies, and our spirits. Like with any other issue, the first step is to acknowledge your trauma. Healing from trauma is not a one-size-fits-all approach. Thus, the process may vary widely depending on the individual as well as the specific circumstances surrounding the trauma. It is also key to mention that it may take months, years, or even longer to heal from trauma. It doesn't happen overnight. So keep in mind, healing and recovery requires patience. It's a marathon and not a sprint. Acknowledging pain, understanding it, and seeking support are not signs of weakness, rather acts of courage and strength. As a community, we can begin to break generational curses, reclaim our stories, and embrace the healing we all deserve. Throughout season 1, you'll hear from subject matter experts who have an up-close and personal perspective on trauma. You'll have an opportunity to also hear real stories from people who have walked through trauma and who have persevered. That's called resilience. So as we bring this to a close, let's do a recap. We discussed what trauma is. It's an emotional response to a terrible event. We talked about the 3 types of traumas: acute, chronic, and complex. We also talked about examples of trauma: childhood abuse, interpersonal violence. We touched on the consequences of trauma: behavioral, emotional, and physical, as well as briefly highlighted, trauma in the Black community, but we are going to do a deeper dive in episode 3. And we also talked about healing from trauma, whether that be through therapy, counseling, faith and spirituality, or supportive networks in self-care. So, as we bring this to a close, I want to thank you for joining me for another episode of Unspoken Truths, Trauma in the Black Community. Remember, your voice matters, your healing matters, and together we will rise. If today's conversation resonated with you, or if you know someone who can benefit from this insight, please like, share, and subscribe so we can continue to break our silence. It's important to understand that no one should ever feel as though they must walk this path alone. With the proper support systems in place, we can rise above the adversities caused by our trauma. Join me next time as we continue speaking the unspoken and healing the unseen. Until then, stay strong, stay rooted, and remember, collectively, we can break generational curses, one person at a time. Take care. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share.